Welcome to the Cloud Connectors mini topics, where we cover a specific tool or technique to help you build, test, and scale your HR integrations. We'll spend the next 7 minutes setting up a REST trigger to accept incoming data and start your integration workflow. While many HR integrations are built to move batch data on a scheduled basis, there are advantages in some scenarios to getting data pushed through in as close to real-time as possible. Let's say you're running a talent acquisition service, and your goal is to get the best candidates applied to jobs that fit them in your client organization's applicant tracking systems. Your clients and your well-matched candidates won't want to wait until the integration runs tomorrow morning or this afternoon or even in 15 minutes. As soon as you get a candidate who's a great match for an opening, you'll want to push them right across. And using a REST trigger to start your integration, you can accomplish that, pushing that matching candidate's data through to its destination as soon as they are identified as a match. I'm starting out here with a nearly empty workflow. Other than the default inputs and outputs, all I have is a JSON write file node, which is standing in for everything that would normally happen in your integration workflow. We cover the transformation step and the actual load process in other mini topics. But with the write file in place, we'll be able to capture the data that we send to the integration to verify that it works. For more information about using write file, check out mini topic 1. But just to review the configurations I have in place, I can double-click the node and see that I'm going to capture my entire payload, beautify it, and save it to a file called rest_data.json in my mini topics directory. Thinking a few steps ahead, let's set a debug halt on the write file node. Now I just need a REST trigger to be able to accept data for processing, or in this simple example, saving to a file. To do that, I'll go to the left-hand panel and choose the Packages list, and search for and install the Triggers pack. Next, I'll go to the Nodes list and install the REST request node. In workflows where there are multiple possible responses, or where you don't want to give a response until the process is complete, you can use the REST response node. But for this one, we'll keep it simple and drag out and wire up just the REST request trigger node. You'll notice it looks a lot like the standard in node, as a little circle instead of a larger square. This is because, just as the standard in node is where the workflow starts when it's run manually, this node will be the starting point of your workflow once it's deployed and the endpoint URL we configure is invoked. In fact, for this exercise, we won't even wire up the standard in node. To configure your REST request trigger, double-click on it. And while we will skip it here, please keep in mind that a good description is really helpful to have on all nodes in production integrations. First, we'll set a method. We support all the standard methods, and since we talked about pushing a candidate, post is the one we'll use here. Next, let's choose a REST path, keeping in mind that it cannot be identical to the paths configured in any other workflows you plan to deploy in the same environment. Here, I'll configure mine as create/candidate. Then, we need to configure the payload attribute to store the node output. The default is REST, meaning that whatever is sent to your workflow will show up in payload.rest. I'll leave it as is, but you could certainly change it to reflect the type of data that you're expecting, like candidate or new hire. Finally, since we didn't install the REST response companion node, we need to enable automatic reply, which causes the platform gateway to issue an HTTP 202 response indicating that the request has been accepted and will be processed. We'll leave the other options empty for now. To test, I'll scroll to the top of the config panel and click on the expand panel icon, and in the expanded panel, I can scroll to the bottom and click on test trigger. In the test panel, I can see the full URL where I'll be able to post once the workflow is deployed. We'll come back to that in a bit. In order to launch our test, we need to set a content type. For this scenario, let's make it application/JSON, and then we'll create some body content. For a minimalist candidate, all we need is a first name, last name, an email address, and a mobile phone number. It's also possible to set custom headers and define query parameters, but for this example, we don't need those. Click Test and the integration will run and the write file operation will complete. If we look at the node output in the debug panel, we can see that the payload has a REST attribute, and within that we've got details about the content type, the empty list of query parameters, and the body that we sent over. If we go into the Files area, just above our candidates file from mini topic 1, we can see our REST data file in the mini topics directory. And if we edit it, we'll see our test data as expected. I'll go ahead and delete the file now from the triple dot menu and use the GE keyboard shortcut to return to the editor console. To make this accessible for posts from the outside world, we need to deploy the workflow. And to do that, just go to the Deploy option in the drop-down at the upper right corner of the editor console. Because we've just created this workflow, most of these details, such as the workflow summary, are not set, but for purposes of this exercise, we can run with the defaults. In a production workflow, you might want to fine-tune each of the deployment steps. I can validate my trigger configs by clicking the Edit button in the Trigger step, but since I don't want to change anything, I'll just jump right to the end and click Deploy. Once I've done that, I'll see my workflow deployed, and I can switch to the Triggers view in the Deployments menu, where I can expand my triggers entry and copy the endpoint URL. To test the connection from the outside world, I'll go ahead and start up Postman and paste in the URL and set the method to post, and set the body to deliver our JSON payload. I click Send and get an error that there's no authorization header because we didn't configure an API key for our connection. Let's do that now. It'll just take a minute. Going back into the editor console, if I click on the globe icon at the top, I'll see an option to manage my environment. Integration developers and implementation specialists should have these permissions. If you don't, please check with your team lead. Once in the Manage screen, scroll down to the API Tokens section and click the Generate button. Give it a meaningful description, then choose Trigger as the role and Bearer as the type, and click Generate again. You'll only get this token once, so if you don't want to have to regenerate it in the real world, you'd want to save it. For now, I'll just copy and paste it into my Postman configurations, setting the header name to authorization and the value to bearer, followed by a space and the API key. Click Send again, and Postman is acting as a proxy for your system, pushing the data through. Sure enough, it gets the 202 accepted response. If we go back to the platform, log back into the environment, and look at the logs, we can see that a REST trigger was invoked just a moment ago. And if we go into the Files area, we can see that in the Mini Topics folder, we have a newly created rest_data.json file, which, if we edit it, we can see contains the data we sent over from our Postman client. Thank you for watching the Cloud Connectors mini topic on setting up REST triggers. You'll see this technique used in other mini topics as well. Please check out all the mini topics in the Cloud Connectors channel to learn about the platform tools available for your integrations.